Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin. Welcome back, everyone. Another happy new year. I don't know if we can say that. Any resolution on your side, Christian?
Hey, Marc. I always have the same resolution, be a bit more fit, reduce the caffeine intake, but that doesn't seem to work. So I will just go with be more fit.
But close to where you live, do you have like a gym or green space?
Not at all.
Not at all. So that's just going to be caffeine.
Doesn't help.
Okay, let's dive into the topic. So do you have a nice speaker to introduce to us today?
Yes, today we have a superstar joining us because today we have someone that has worked as a systems and customer engineer in companies like EMC, Dell, Google Cloud, among others. She is well known in the biotech and life science space as a community builder, as well as in the space of women in tech. She holds a degree on a Master's of Mechanical Engineering from the University of Exeter, and just recently completed a master's in bioinformatics. She's also well known for being always a top performer, very value-driven, a great colleague to work with, an amazing person. With us today, we have Amber Hilton. Welcome, Amber.
Welcome, Amber.
Thanks, Christian. That was some intro.
Any New Year resolution on your side?
You know what? A couple of years ago, I made so many New Year's resolutions that it just stressed my entire January out. So since then, my New Year's resolution is not to have any resolutions and just enjoy January. And it worked well last year, so I'm going to do the same in 2023.
Clever. Marc, you actually didn't mention yours.
Yeah, I'm not really sure yet. I haven't decided. For 2022, I decided in February what was my New Year resolution, which was like running half marathon, doing more sport on that extent, which I did. So I was happy for that. But the important part was like, let's have January pass by, try to distill the information, distill what I should do and decide a bit later on.
That's really interesting because both you and I mentioned something health related. And for today's topic, we're talking about, I would say, the next level of it, which is biotech analytics or biotech in general. With you, Amber, which I'm quite new to this world. And I always hear about biotech, medtech. Can you explain to the audience what is the difference between those two terms?
Yeah, sure. So it's actually an ongoing discussion. And I think there's different definitions. Everyone else has their own boundaries of where the cutoffs are. But you can think of it in terms of biotech as the understanding of biological data, measuring biological data. It's much more in the drug discovery space. Medtech is much more around diagnostics, devices, instruments you might have in hospitals or clinician settings. And then health tech is the next level on, which is how clinicians actually use that data or how people use that data to inform their health routines or understand what treatments they might want to take depending on the health data about themselves. So it's sort of these three different categories that people tend to focus on.
Okay, so in some extent, they're a bit integrated to each other, we will say. The interesting part is when we discussed about biotech with Christian initially, I was like, okay, biotech, so trackers, information about the body, and I thought directly about Fitbit and Garmin. Is it like a good first introduction to biotech, or is it actually not a good way to think about it from your point of view?
From my point of view, I think the fitness trackers are definitely more on the medtech, health tech side of things.
All right. Okay.
Biotech is much more if you're thinking about measuring, let's say, genomics or proteins. A lot of people tend to classify it under the omics, which is basically understanding the data about the cells in your body as opposed to your entire organism, which is more on the health tech side. But it's going into terminology a little bit. But yeah, like I said, it's a spectrum, and I think it doesn't matter too much about the exact language we're using. I think we're all talking about the same thing, which is using data to improve health outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one big question that I have, perhaps as a data person, when we talk about biotech, you talk about genomics, and how did you collect this data, or where does the data come from?
Yeah, it's probably why this is such a hot topic at the moment and why it's taken off in the last, let's say sort of 10, 15 years. Biology is incredibly complex. So I don't know if you've read the book Sapiens.
I heard about it.
Not for me.
Okay, so that should be your New Year's resolution.
Thank you.
On the first page, it talks about how the fundamentals of the universe is governed by physics. Physics introduced matter, which is what we know to be chemistry, and matter formed together to make organisms, which we know to be biology. Biology is incredibly complex. The human cell, if you think about the amount of functions it has, the amount of different components that make up a human cell. In the past, it's been very difficult to measure what's going on inside a human cell because we haven't had the actual technology in terms of lab equipment or knowledge to know how to measure what's happening inside a cell because you can't see it with the human eye. And so a lot of the theories about biology have been very much based on observation of outcome rather than observation of what's actually happening. But over the last, let's say, 20 years or so, the technologies to start to measure what's actually happening have been increasing incredibly. So we have new equipment for the labs, we have new genomic sequencing methods, being able to actually read the genome at a single sort of base pair level is suddenly available to us, which we never had before. The first ever human genome project, it took expertise, infrastructure, and people from 20 institutions. It took 13 years of work and over $3 billion to generate a single genome structure for a human. We can now do that for about $1,000 for one single person within 3 days.
Massive reduction.
And I think it's even come along since then. So you can imagine sort of the explosion of data. It's just because our ability to measure the data has increased exponentially, that the amount of data available has increased at the same level. And it's a repetitive loop. The more we know, the more we measure, the more we measure, the more we know. It's really changing the way I think we think about treatment, the way we think about healthcare, the way we think about health equity, which wasn't ever available before based on what we knew.
But that's still like incredibly difficult to conceptualize. I mean, maybe from my point of view, or to collect this information basically, because you're speaking about like collecting information in the cells. Like I actually don't know what could be the right term, but like maybe acidity in the environment, certain level of specific components like potassium, etc. So that's a very wide diversity of, I want to say, tools and measurement equipment. I mean, that's kind of complex to make like everything talk to each other upstream to like somewhere to store this data, right?
Yeah, and I think it's recognized as probably, as I said, one of the more complicated fields, and the multidimensionality issue when it comes to biology is huge. And I often think of researchers in this field as artists, or sort of the artists of science, because the amount of creativity they have to bring together the types of things they're measuring, it's got so much uniqueness to it. Every researcher has a different unique way of doing their research, different way of measuring things, have different theories and hypotheses about how these different dimensions of things they can measure interact with each other. So yeah, I think the research itself is full of personality. It actually makes the interoperability issue 10 times worse, because it's like trying to get a bunch of artists to standardize on the way they do art. You know, it's never going to happen. So, but how can we try and extract a level of standardization in the data, so the data at least can be interoperable? And that's where there's new standards coming in, or maybe they're not so new, but there's a lot of focus on it at the moment around FAIR data. And this is so researchers and the way that we measure biology can be repeatable. And there's some crazy statistics that I just pulled out earlier on that 70% of research that is done is not reproducible.
What?
It's essentially wasted research. And this is exactly it, because what you said about the fact there are so many things to measure in a cell that if you don't measure the same things every time, your research isn't repeatable. And so trying to standardize on those types of things is really challenging. I found that every year, 10.2 billion euros is lost because research data isn't collected in a fair way.
All right. Okay.
And I can explain what FAIR means, because it's actually an acronym as opposed to just a general word about the data. So FAIR is findable, accessible, reusable, and interoperable.
Okay, well, that's quite interesting aspect I was not considering, and I'm guessing like in the software industry, and we know the ISO standards that applies to so many things in life. This is an area that is quite developing in terms of like standardizing this aspect. Sorry for those creative people. Needs to be a bit more like structured in this aspect.
Yeah. From your experience, are you seeing like some sort of a conversion between, like the techniques that are using between tools, or how do you see this standard coming along, not only in the government, but also in the tooling, on the data, the technology? Have you seen a trend?
As the amount of data collected became bigger and bigger and bigger, organizations were starting to feel the pain. Sort of the standard data warehouse strategy no longer worked. And they realized how much money they were losing because of the fact that their research was not reproducible. And I think another statistic is that 50% of researchers' time is spent reproducing other researchers' work.
All right.
So I think when businesses look at it this way, they realize actually this is an area they need to invest in. But if you take a researcher and you force them to work in this really locked down way where their research is standardized, you take away their creativity and you take away their ability to be that sort of artist of science. So I think there's been a lot of investment in tooling to help researchers be creative and do the science in the best way possible, but actually have tools that take away the burden of storing their data in a reproducible way, adding that metadata to it, adding the information that makes it reproducible for researchers in the future. So it's not becoming a burden on the researchers, but actually there's this tooling and this automated data pipelines that sit in between that elevate the data to a certain level. And there's a lot of talk around data mesh for research, being able to make that data reusable, findable by other researchers. And so I think there's been a lot of investment more so in the tooling and allowing the researchers to do the science and not be burdened by the tooling and the data processing side of it.
How did you find it now that you are, I would say, hands-on with sequencing? Do you find any specific challenge? Because I guess you can now empathize a lot with those artists. You're becoming an artist yourself as well.
I think it's a long way to go till I could call myself that. But it's been really interesting actually getting hands-on with the data and understanding it, because you realize how raw the data is that they are playing with. So you've got the researchers who, in my mind, a typical researcher is someone who works in a lab and they actually measure the biology. Then you've got a lot of bioinformatics is almost the next step, where they take the data that's been, or take the measurements that the researchers have created and start to derive some insights from it. And so you're measuring things like you'll have a 1 gigabyte file that is just full of a sequence of letters.
Wow.
And you've got to try and interpret that file and compare it and contrast it and try and find patterns from it, etc. And I think this is where the use of AI starts to become really important, because what you're trying to do, you're looking at huge sets of data and you're trying to find patterns in that. And I think that's where the value of AI starts to come in, especially when you're looking at the same set of data across thousands of people. How can you start to use AI? But going back to the problem of sort of the standards around the data, the standard is that 2/3 of people agree that data is not of a good enough quality to be used in AI models. So first we need to solve the problem of the data quality before we can actually get to the next step, which is applying AI to that data so we can start automating some of those insights. But yeah, it's been really interesting playing with that data, understanding where the quality issues are, understanding how much work needs to go into validating the data. And then also, I think one of the big problems is that the data sizes themselves are huge. So you need to take that into consideration when building visualizations or reports, that actually the processing power required is quite huge.
Coming back to another episode we did about AI, that was interesting because 2 of the episodes we discussed about using machine learning, NLP techniques, etc. And some of the challenges they were facing is the data set they were working with are quite limited. And you showing like really the opposite in a term of bioinformatics, where you have so much data, you really need to use AI. I remember with Christian, we are quite surprised to see that. Maybe I'm curious actually to understand more about the other kind of type of data. So I'm thinking about like things like sound or imagery as well. Are they like kind of rising, or is it something we're always been part of the biotech realm of data they're collecting?
Yeah, definitely. So genomic sequencing is one of them. The progress in genomic sequencing is incredible, but equally imaging. We have much more sophisticated ways of imaging cells now. So I said before that a lot of the previous theories around biology were very dogmatic. They were very based in observation because we couldn't see what was happening. But now sort of the microscopy capabilities that we have, the ability to see what's happening on a molecular level within a cell. There's things like a lot of development in high throughput sequencing, single cell imaging, and the size of those images are insane. You would, for instance, you might have a plate that has, let's say, 25 wells in the plate, and those wells have some cells in them. And you then are taking pictures of those cells from every angle, every second for 24 hours, for instance. I'm playing with these numbers a little bit. And then you are analyzing how the cell changes according to different chemicals or, like you said, different temperatures, etc. And you're trying to spot the differences between the different cells or within the plate. To process that, you need huge amounts of computing power.
And the amount of data collecting is just massive.
Yeah.
We're into the petabyte of data maybe for some projects.
I think we're looking almost at exabyte data levels at this point.
Wow.
And they say that 90% of all healthcare related data is imaging data. And I'm not sure whether that is in terms of data points or size of the actual data file, but still it gives an idea as to just the volume that we're trying to process there.
So happy that we found someone on the big data team.
Exactly.
So we say hi to Alex Locum. See, he was on the small data team. We found someone on the big data team.
It's amazing. It gives us these insights that we never had before. And ultimately, I think I don't want to forget about the reason that this is also interesting is because the impact is on health, and it's about providing healthier lives for our ever-increasing population. It's about providing equitable health outcomes. Yeah. It's about reducing the cost of delivering health outcomes. So I think that's true. We shouldn't ever lose sight of the value behind this data. It's not just science for science sake. It is actually about delivering better quality lives.
Quick one. If you're enjoying this episode and our show, please make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Links on the description as per usual.
Also, if you'd like to grow this community with us, think about sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague interested about all things data.
Now, back to the episode. Do you have any use case? Not to say favorite, but I like this use of biotech when it comes to data.
What this new wave of interest in biotech has allowed to happen, that it's reducing the cost to be able to understand biological functions. And with that, it means there is business sense behind looking into rare diseases, which was previously just not feasible, right?
It was far too expensive to consider.
Way too expensive to research, to analyze. But now with these huge amounts of data sets that we have, with the access to AI, with access to running simulations rather than having to do wet lab testing all the time, that has enabled us to actually start developing drugs and treatments for rare diseases, which previously weren't commercially viable. So you see a lot of biotech companies who are starting to invest in rare diseases, who are starting to develop drugs for, let's say, hundreds or thousands of people rather than millions of people. There's some really interesting companies actually that are using knowledge graph data, using existing drug data, using cause and effect data, doing a whole ton of analysis on what research has already been done, on what proteins exist, what compounds exist, and just from a data level, being able to crunch those numbers and be able to come up with hypotheses about drugs that could solve for rare diseases. So people who have life-threatening diseases, people who live with chronic pain, but they're so unique, it's not a big enough problem for big pharma to tackle. So it's almost lowering the barrier to entry because the cost of data acquisition, although it's still high, it's lower than the cost of acquiring huge research facilities. And so more niche players are coming in, the competition in this space is rising. And so generally the quality of maybe we won't see it for another 5 to 10 years, but I think the quality of health treatments is improving with that as well.
That's really interesting. You speaking about like those biotech technology, more startup compared to big pharma. When you started to describe the imagery and the amount of data, what it costs in a way to process all this data, I'm surprised that you said like it costs much less now, because so I'm guessing this is in some aspect the power of cloud as well, being able to scale easily.
Yeah, and I mean, the perfect example is previously, well, still, to predict the structure of a protein, which is somewhat essential in organic compound analysis and drug discovery. The previous methods for doing that would be to do something like X-ray crystallography to understand the shape of the protein. It doesn't matter too much about the science behind how X-ray crystallography works, but what does matter is it would cost on average $100,000 per protein. And it would take months and months of research. Now we can do it in half an hour using AlphaFold on a GPU server, and it costs several dollars. So that's what I mean when I say, sure, the processing power required is huge, and that is definitely where cloud comes into play, because it's very, very peaky workloads. You're not running high performance compute 24 hours a day. You're running a single simulation. That's the difference in terms of the barrier to entry that allows companies to experiment very quickly, fail fast, fail cheap, because you're not experimenting in a lab anymore. You're experimenting in a Jupyter notebook or on some HPC pipelines.
I don't want to say again, I want to be devil's advocate, because I say...
You like to say that in every single episode, the devil's advocate.
But I mean, I think that with that also brings another element of this, which is data privacy. Because with cloud, we have the concept of data sovereignty. How do you see this, the privacy of this data comparing to perhaps other sectors? I'm assuming that there are even different regulations per country.
It varies depending on what you're looking at. If you look at that spectrum again, from sort of drug discovery to delivering the treatment to the patient, the closer you get to the drug discovery end, the less privacy concerns you have, because you are analyzing chemicals and compounds and proteins, right? It's not personal. But the moment you start actually, let's say, testing it on a human, or you start analyzing a particular human's genome because you're looking for a variant that a specific human is showing, you do need to be careful about how you store that. You can't just sort of be storing someone's genome and have their name all over it, because if that information gets leaked, you might be, for instance, it comes to the question of health insurance that we see a lot in the US, that if you note somewhere that a person has a very high probability of getting cancer because that's identifiable in their genome, then you're making that person potentially liable to having high insurance costs, etc. So you need to be very careful about what you do with that data, and different countries have different regulations, but it isn't as sensitive as clinical data, let's say. So clinical data has very, very strict guidelines around it. Each country has their own set of regulations and compliance. Yeah. And I think a lot of cloud providers are very aware of that. And so look to gain those certifications against those regulations, and try and make it easier again for startups or digital native companies to come in and not have to worry too much about the regulations, because a lot of cloud services already think about that when they build their solutions. But it doesn't mean that they can forget about all of their responsibilities with patient data, because it is highly, highly confidential.
Okay, and so this is evolving super rapidly from what you described into not now what we are being able to achieve using cloud technology and using data science overall. What are the big trends in biotech, medtech, and health tech overall from what you see, and all this kind of sectors, this industry is evolving at the moment?
How to summarize this? I'll go from biotech to health tech. So in biotech, I think one of the big things that we're seeing is what we're calling third generation sequencing. It's a new way of sequencing the genome, where previously we could only read it in very short chunks and then we had to reform it. Now we can read it in much longer chunks, and that's making it cheaper. It's making it much more accurate. And so we're going to see another explosion of data off the back of that, where it you already see sort of initiatives, sort of it went from the single human genome project to the 1,000 to the 10,000 to the, 1 million genome project. We're looking at collecting genomes across as many diverse groups as possible. I think there was something about collecting the genome of every baby born in the UK, those types of things that are now starting to become possible. And I say these technologies, they exist, but they're very, very new and they're still in development. And that also then leads into the medtech side, where there's going to be, I think, a lot more devices around measuring your own genome, tracking your own likelihood for diseases, etc. Because as it becomes cheaper and cheaper to measure your genome, like I've got friends and people I know that, I'm just going to send off, whether it's 23andMe or these other types of gene tracking services, like it's accessible now, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So having newer and newer diagnostic services. And then when that comes to the health tech side of things, it's actually a totally different conversation and really interesting as well. But you can't just start providing the NHS with all of your worries and concerns about potential diseases that you might have because you went and did this genome test, because the healthcare systems can't deal with that much information. They don't want that much information. Your GP does not want to know every mutation in your genome. That's not helpful for them because they have a certain level of resourcing and they need to address the most urgent things. And so I think the trends that we'll see in the health tech side are actually tools when it comes to actually interpreting and understanding your own data. You can't rely on your GP to interpret your own data about your healthcare. So I think there'll be a lot more tools in the consumer space. So you go and get your genome recorded or measured, and then you have the tools in front of you, whether it's an app or a report that actually starts to translate it and gives you advice of what to do with this information, not to panic that you've got a single mutation in one of your genes that actually means nothing. So I think from end to end, they're sort of the trends that we'll see. Yeah. This is my perspective.
Super valuable.
I'm sure there are many others. And
so becoming more personalized and more accessible to anyone. Like we're becoming close, like our own advisor in some aspects, or at least being advised directly, not from the GP as you explained. Yeah. So from people listening, a lot are data analysts, data scientists. Do you think it's easy for them without any background in biotech, in medical studies, etc., to enter this sector, this industry, or there is like some requirements to go for some specific qualifications, maybe?
I think it really depends how deep you want to get in terms of like the interpretation of it. And you see a lot of health tech companies who are interpreting data. They will hire a lot of data scientists who have no understanding, and then they'll hire a few clinicians that can actually help them understand. Data scientists can see the patterns, but they might not necessarily know what it means in terms of a health outcome. So the clinicians are there to help interpret the patterns that the data scientists find. But I think like the likes of the course that I did, the bioinformatics course, it is the intersection of data science and biology. And so that's the type of course that is very accessible to any data scientist who's interested in learning more about the biology and how to actually interpret this data and what it means. Like I said at the beginning, biology is so complex that no one person can understand everything. You need a team of people to actually try and understand it. And as much as a data scientist might not understand all the biology, a biologist or a clinician isn't going to understand how to do the data science side of it. So I think coming together is what we really need.
It's a real teamwork in this case.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on about NLP, and this is an interesting one as well. And it was interesting listening to the previous podcast about not having enough data in the legal sector or enough documents in the legal sector to actually be able to build the models on. And like I said, I'm in the big data camp, and there's a repository, a centralized place where most publications of research are put on this place. It's called PubMed. And PubMed sees 1,000 new research publications every day. And that means that if you're a scientist working in a specific field, trying to keep up with the latest information about whether it's tuberculosis or COVID, whatever it, imagine if you're trying to work in COVID, the amount of new papers that come out every single day on it, and trying to stay on top of that is absolutely insane. And so tools like NLP are starting to also really take off in this space. to be able to actually interpret that volume of data, build knowledge graphs around it, try and help bridge assumptions, try to connect different pieces of research together that might be interesting, because you can't assume that every scientist knows what every other scientist is doing at any one point in time. And then on top of that, you have the compounding effect that publications aren't all done in the same language. So researchers don't speak every language in the world, but papers are published in every language in the world. So having NLP tools that can understand the research, but also understand the research in every language. So researchers aren't wasting time repeating bits of research that have previously been done in another country, for instance.
There are a lot of challenges there as well, as have a targeted translation, not just something that you can copy paste into a Google Translate. There is jargon, there is a very specific concept.
Definitely.
And for our audience, that is another area that they can actually try to explore, right? That may not be necessarily that targeted into the health space, but it's data engineering, data science, AI, modeling, and you contribute to this industry.
And there's the amount of words that are used to explain the same thing is crazy as well. Like when it comes to talking about a specific type of cancer, there might be 100 different ways to say the same type of cancer. That as well, it's difficult to actually pick up for NLP models. And that's why you see specific NLP models for medical language, just to try and overcome that barrier.
Very true.
We're getting to the top of the hour. So we have one question that we ask to every guest. The question is, what is the single most important professional piece of advice you ever received?
I had a really good one, but then I listened to one of your episodes the other week and somebody else said it, which was always to be known for something. I can't remember who was it who said that. So I would say, choose to do something that you're genuinely interested in. It makes work so much more fun. It means learning about that topic is fun and not a chore. And it means that you speak about it with energy and passion and enthusiasm, and it's kind of contagious. I love working with people who are really passionate about their topic. And so I think that would be my one sort of professional advice is stick to what you love, not what you know.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your advice.
And as well, Amber, where do people can go and learn more about the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are running a health tech community every 2 months in London, along with our partner Somex. So it'd be great to see anyone join us there. I will always posting about it on LinkedIn. So follow me on LinkedIn and you'll hear when the events are. So it'd be great to see you there and chat with other people in the industry who are also passionate about this topic.
Amazing. We will put the links on the description of this episode for everyone to see it.
Thank you, Amber, for taking the time to share with us those insights about biotech and this very incredible industry. What is reassuring is seeing like all this data being used like to really improve the health of everyone. So it's really an excited field you're in at the moment. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me share my passion of biotech. And it was great chatting with you both.
There we go.
Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday. And until then, keep your data caffeinated.